All right, everyone, welcome to the last conversation of Mises 2021. This one's called Projected Bodily Movement, and we're going to focus on works by Louis Hawk, Nima Bahramand, and Emily Van Loan, who are here with us today to discuss this idea, or at least start with a discussion of this idea of projected bodily movement, which is a concept by an architecture theorist, a Welsh architecture theorist named Adam Hardy, who has this idea that in some ways you make sense of architecture by imagining how one might move through it, right? And so rather than just focus on kind of formal lines and forms, you're using your audiovisual sensibilities to imagine or project that an animal, human or otherwise, might move through a space in a certain kind of a way. And when we look at a piece of architecture, we immediately understand it or make sense of it in some way by imagining that bodily movement. And to me, that this notion really seems relevant to installation art in general, right? That we see these kind of works that are structured and designed in space, and that space is specific and particular to the work. Obviously, they're in a gallery setting or something like that as well, which contributes to it. But the work itself has a design that goes beyond just the facing a rectangular screen sitting in an audience. And so, what I wonder is how, in your works, in particular the installation work, how this kind of idea of projecting movement changes it, and how it might adapt the audiovisual sort of sensibility to a more architectural sensibility, or maybe a more structured sensibility, if it does at all. And honestly, anybody could start, but I was thinking specifically of Lewis's piece when I thought about this, because it seems it's right when you enter the space, it asks us to interact with it in a certain way. I just wonder if you could talk about that.
Okay, perhaps is this picking up? Good. How many of you have seen the work Otherworld? Okay, I'll give a brief description. It's there are 4 screens on each of 4 sides of you when you sit in the center of it, and those images are of feral animals that are roaming around my house at night, which includes raccoons and bobcats and coyotes and rabbits and skunks and possums and rats and mice. And I recorded them and edited them down into 4 screens. And I made it during COVID. So I put these 4 screens onto one screen and distributed it, in film festivals and the like. And you could look at all 4 screens at once. It had a description of how it should have been laid out as an installation, but it was not as interesting to me, because once you get it in a space and you have a screen here, and a screen there, and a screen there, and a screen behind you, and there's activity on the screens, but not necessarily all the time, it forces a corporal participation. And then you're looking at this, and then you don't see anything on this screen, so you look around behind you to see if there's something happening there, and something there or there. So your body is really moving around to get the experience. And metaphor is the kind of experience that I had. Initially, I didn't realize these animals were roaming around my house. And then I put up a camera to see what was running across my roof, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And I realized all these animals were around my house. It's like you're unconscious. When you go to sleep, you have all these dreams, which you are there, you're there, but you don't really quite participate in them. Well, all these animals were roaming around my house, and I didn't know it. So when I was asleep, I didn't know all this stuff was happening. This whole circus of animals were parading around, procreating, fornicating, foraging. And so I have my window next to my bedroom. So I imagine the window next to my bedroom was like these windows or screens in the gallery. And so you had to actually look through different windows. As if in my house, I would look through the window to see if I could see what was happening outside. So the idea is to metaphor my experience of these animals, which was looking out to see them, and also to have to look for them. They weren't just out there in front of you like a screen. You actually had to participate in the garnering of these images off the screens to make sense out of it. Is that?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, when my experience of the piece, and honestly, I brought my 5-year-old to see that installation, and she absolutely loved it. And part of the joy of it in some ways was the anticipation, right? That you've created each window in the work creates a space where you start to imagine what might happen next, right? And so that sense of anticipation keeps you engaged, but you're always missing something on another screen, right? And so by the end of her experience with your work, she was just spinning in circles, getting dizzy, and almost fell over. And I just thought that it really showed how that you can have this embodied experience that installation provides, that maybe sitting back in a chair doesn't anymore. Like if you had just put 4 channels up on the screen that we could have watched, right? That kind of bodily movement, projected and real, is what adds another layer of depth and engagement maybe with the work.
Well, I should have started by thanking Nima for setting up the installation and the invitation to do so, because it's the first time I have not seen it yet. This afternoon I'll see it for the first time in the form that I had imagined. I did see it in my studio with a little screen here and a big screen there and another one over there between various objects. So this is really going to be a delight for me.
Yeah, it was really a lot of fun, and it was a lot of fun to set up as well. Good job, Nima. Speaking of Nima, I wonder if you might, in Nima's piece, Blowback, I think really engages with this notion on multiple levels, and it becomes kind of cross-border level of engagement with this projected idea of movement, like how you might imagine yourself, or not even yourself, but how you might imagine someone or something, some creature being in a space that is kind of other to where we are.
Yeah, so it's very kind of odd for me to hold a mic. It's very unfamiliar for me. But yeah, so let me briefly explain about the Blowback, because it's just like 3-channel, around 5 minutes video synchronized installation, and it has very based on the found footage that came from a collection that I gathered from the Middle East that been streamlined through Prescope application, which I called them restless image, and it was one of the image video that came from this collection. That these are like collection of people, like imageless people from the Middle East that just feel the agency to record something and stream it online with 0 follower, 0 viewer, just stream it. And I think it was for me very valuable when you collaborate with a sensor, body and sensor, to record some situation, even if it's just a dark screen. And all the situation in this piece guided by these found footage, and all the 3D element come from this footage, most of them. But the way that I tried to install it was because of the complexity of the situation in Middle East. Because at the same time, when I was working on this piece, I was reading a diary by Gertrude Bell, who she was a hiker, archaeologist, line maker, spy, ambassador who was sent by Winston Churchill to Middle East to draw all this line around, like divide Syria and Iraq and don't give a land to Kurdish people because they were like rebellion people. Could not make the work easy for the colonial people to just pull out the resources from the region. Also, at the same time, I was reading a diary by Middle East, a soldier in Middle East. Also, Psychonopedia by Reza Negarestani. There was a lot of complexity. That's why I use, like, most of my projects are multi-channel, because I have a complex mind. I'm all the time unclear about the situation, and I'm not trying to inform any people or give data to the people or educate any people through my art, because I think that the world is that much complex that it's enough that we are getting out from the university and schools, and we don't need to educate people anymore, just teach them how to be human first. And so the reason that I use multi-channel is the complexity of the situation I'm engaging with, and also put the viewer in the complex situation that sometimes they miss some text. They cannot understand the relationship between the text, because the text that coming on the screen is a combination of all these like 3 texts, and also some texts that are written. I wrote by myself and just try to connect them, but they are also disjointed because the situation is very fragmented for me. And so at some point in 5 minutes, a short period of time, you might just read 2 lines of the text and just be engaged with the images that sometimes we are just used to like digest the image better than the text. And leave the work in abstract situation, I think can create some sort of confusion for the viewer that when they leave the space can think and can remember some situation. And maybe, yeah, I don't know if I could answer the question, but I'm
Well,
all over the
there's-
place.
There's something that really, I think, happens in the piece that is almost brought about by the materials used, right? And when we use screens, we often try to, I think, ignore the materiality of them and try to ignore like the bezel, right? Like on the monitor, right? And the gap that it makes between the two images, because you have this interplay between images that go across all three screens and are connected, and yet they're not, right? They're separated by the bezel of the monitor. And then some images exist only in smaller rectangles or squares within that bezel, and they are disconnected, right? Yet they're all actually in some way disconnected.
They're all connected to each other because like all this 3D modeling, except like the models gray, come from this found footage that I did through photogeometry, Maya, and like Unity. It doesn't matter the technique, but the thing is they are all connected. But at some point when you pay attention and just put more effort on some topic, you can just bring it out and pump it out. But like by putting all these like found footage that they are like on phone screen, that's slamming the high quality 3D generator and devaluing the static, was like how we devaluating some situation by paying attention to something because of this and this. And yeah, it was also like because of devaluing and valuing some situation by just playing with this static.
Yeah, it plays as a kind of signal to noise ratio, where you start to realize that you're not sure which is the signal and which is the noise.
Yeah.
And Emily, your piece involves something different, yet I think related and similar in live performance, live musical performance along with image. And I wonder if you have any resonance with the ideas so far that we've been talking about when it comes to installation work, like how that might transfer into performance, because I think installation has within it this inherent performance. In fact, it asks almost the viewer to perform in a certain way, to perform the piece, right? It's almost like a score, and then you walk in and perform it, but you're as the artist are actually performing yours.
Yeah, I think there's like a similarity, or we can make connections about like a presence. Like there is a presence of the viewer that's intentional, I think, in installation. And I wonder if the presence of the viewer feels more intentional when there is the presence of the artist as well. And the artist is doing a performance along with their film. I think that is one of the reasons that I thought a live performance of the sound would work well, because I think for my film, the presence of the artist's hand is really important, and to know that there is like a person behind the thoughts and the images is what I intend to create a connection between the audience and the artist. And I think my presence and my performance has the potential to further that connection between me and the audience. And I think maybe an installation, like the idea that someone had to set up this installation, like there is the hand in that as well. And then there's the presence of the viewer performing and like connecting with the work in a way that you might not if you're just in an empty room watching a screen. Yeah,
there was a moment when there was audio playing. I think in one of your screenings, audio was playing that wasn't supposed to be playing, but then your almost engagement and interaction with that, I actually heard people talking about that afterwards as like somehow this like added layer of interest and kind of complicating even the idea of your performance being so structured,
Yeah.
right? And that your performance becomes a relationship with the work
Yeah.
that is sort of mediated by a relationship with the audience and the spectator.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. And it's interesting that you say that my performance is structured. It's actually totally improvised. Each time is different. So I don't have like a score that I'm playing. I have like themes that I'm riffing off of. But yeah, that moment where the sound was playing and I was not only engaging, like I'm engaging with the work because there's sound happening that's not supposed to be happening, but I'm also kind of engaging with the projectionist. I'm like talking to them as well. And maybe I'm talking to the audience too to let them know, like, hey, this is not what I was expecting, which is fine because also I don't know really what I'm expecting from the performance anyway because it's so improvised and so kind of off the cuff. Yeah, I think there is definitely, even more engagement with that little moment as well.
Yeah, this idea of presence, I think, is interesting because it actually really nicely leads into kind of the next thematic idea that I wanted to touch on, which really comes from philosopher Juliana Rabentish, and wrote The Aesthetics of Installation Art, which is a formidable text that I think is really worth engaging with. But breaking down the distinction between what was called autonomous versus non-autonomous art, that is to say, autonomous art can be art for art's sake. Simply put, this is a gross oversimplification, but autonomous art can be art for art's sake. It's not bound by the strictures of context and of political situation, right? And non-autonomous art is bound by those things, right? Is bound by its situation. And she didn't like that distinction. And so she believed, or kind of argued, that installation art is kind of the place where that breaks down, because installation art is all about the context in which it's being seen, the ethical context, the political context, the geographic context. It's in a space, in a real place. It can't just be shipped necessarily. I mean, even though it was, right? But it needs to be set up. It needs to be kind of wrought in that way. And then leading on from the breakdown between this binary of autonomous and non-autonomous art, she really challenged the idea of the art object itself. Like, where is the art object in installation? And her argument was essentially that calling the work itself, the piece itself, the art object, was incorrect. And she thought the object was actually in the encounter with the piece. Like, that was the objectness, and ontologically speaking, of the work. And that really the work itself is a subject of viewership, right? A subject of audience, but also a subject of the artist's hand. And then the viewer is, again, another subject. And so really the only object in this relationship is the encounter, is the experience. And I just wonder if that resonates with your piece at all, Lewis, because it immediately made me think of her writing and her work, especially with the audio.
Well, I've always imagined that with installation, you always have a narrative, and it's a corporal narrative when you enter a space that's an installation. And to experience it, you see, you hear, but your body's got to be someplace. And that kind of engagement, I think, is exactly what you're talking about. In reference to what some of the things that Nima was saying in terms of a mediated landscape, I was struck with the idea of that both there's an audio track of the first Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969, and I used all of the audio that referred to recording the event, because the event was recorded, was live broadcast on TV, had large format photography, video, film, and it was not unlike European explorers bringing home the bounty to show what they got from their colonies. And live broadcast TV, presidential salutation to the astronauts, but it only really existed via documentation. In fact, there was a fictional film made about the moon landing. Was never happened. It was all a media entity. And the same thing with the animals outside my house. I only knew they existed when I set up these silly little hunter cameras, and all of a sudden I found that I had a whole, menagerie of feral animals outside my house. So both of these were in fact mediated entities, which are only known by their documentation. And I think when you experience this, you become the authentic viewer, because it's the only viewer you have of these. You're not going to be on the moon. You're not going to be. If I'm in my backyard, the animals aren't there. So this idea of having a corporal presence in the installation is exactly what's impossible in the real. So that was my sense of creating this environment.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well put. I think that Nima's project also brings those ideas up in that sense that we're seeing this this unviewed stream from a place that is very distant, very far away, that we can't be. Right? We don't even have the potential to be there, but we are still having some kind of embodied experience of it as mediated through the work.
Yeah. Also, yeah. Back to the idea of subjectivity and objectivity of the installation. What's happening during the installation is pretty interesting to me, which I mostly prefer to have some sort of installation rather than have it on a string and dictate the viewer that you have to watch it for 90 minutes. And if I leave, I have to be careful, not make any noises or bend my body and not mask the screen and stuff like that. But with the installation, at any moment you can leave. If you don't like it, don't watch it. So it's like the freedom of the people that can wander around and just use. I want to use the word use the piece like as the form of static. With any angle, they can watch it with a different angle, with the reflection of other piece into the piece, or like the other voice or noise or sound that leaking to the other piece, which is like kind of like amazing kind of unsync playful situation that you can have, which is impossible in some sort of theater experience, which is you have to follow some ethics, some rules, be present at the moment. You're gonna miss something, and then I think the conversation most of the time after the screening are about the films, but for the installation is about that. How did you install that? What was the labor? What did you do? Which is also very interesting. It's again like experience of body that happened behind the scene. The artist, the installer, or whoever, the technician, the people that are involved in this process also experience the piece, which is very different than a single projection on this. I really appreciate that. I really enjoy the screening situation, but I think the experience that viewer have is more free, more liberal. I don't want to use this word that been generated by the system, but like there's no word for that. Like more free, like freedom of body. I think it's very important in like viewing installations.
Yeah, there's a freedom to it, but there's also a clear kind of expectation, especially in the design of the whole installation. You're talking about these kind of interactions between works that are together in a room. Like there's a pathway, right? That seems very clear, and there's an expectation. Of course, you can break the
It's a
expectation.
dictatorship that happened behind the scene, but it's very invisible,
Yeah.
right?
So maybe it's more insidious.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it also made me think sort of like the idea of like the secret life of installation art. Like when if nobody is in the gallery to see it, do they start speaking to each other back there, these works? Or, it's kind of like if a tree falls in the forest, right, and no one's around. Emily, I don't know if this resonates with you, but I think that we should talk somewhat about the images in your work, and whether or not that interplay with the xylophone. I guess the question becomes: Are you reacting to those images as you play it? And so can we understand almost the sounds that we're hearing as inspired by or kind of affectively generated by the images that you're watching, or are you not facing it when you play?
Yeah, so I am facing it when I play, and I'm watching it like intermittently, and paying attention to like what part of the film that I'm at. Like there's a moment where there's an image of children's feet jumping across rocks, and I try to be a little bit more whimsical in the soundtrack during those parts. And then the text that says, "You still miss the first boy you ever loved, even though he's also the first boy who ever violated you." That I try to go a little bit on the lower side of the notes, to create like a darker experience. And then there's a moment near the end where the image is a reflection in a mirror, and I'm dancing a little bit, and I try to do a little dancey a little rhythm to go along with that. So yeah, I think I'm definitely reacting to the images, and once I played it like in the middle of an audience, so I was reacting to these images, but it was unclear to most of the rest of the audience that it was even being performed live. So it was like my little secret. But I think I like better being in the front of the room and like people being able to see that I am performing. Yeah.
Yeah, this performative kind of component, I think, to all three works. Some that kind of make you perform yourself, and some where there is like a more maybe even more traditional kind of performance component. It allows for kind of an alignment to occur, I think, where we start maybe to feel not the way you feel about the piece, but we're more directly guided in that moment by how you feel about it today.
Yeah.
Right. And so how an artist feels about their piece obviously changes over time. I think we've all grown to hate a lot of our work, and sometimes maybe to develop some sense of pride or affection for it. And as that changes over time, I think it's interesting, especially if you can reinstall a piece and reinstall it again and make tweaks later and do it a little differently later. It's a little different than just sending around the world on a film festival circuit, right? To be screened in front of an audience in the same way, or to put online for streaming, right? You have this capacity to imprint your latest thoughts on the piece into it, and then it kind of expresses itself back at the viewer in that way.
Yeah, that's what I like about the improvisation in the sound that I perform. Like, it is different every time, and sometimes I don't feel compelled to react to the images as I did the last performance, or I'm usually using phrases from the song "You Are My Sunshine" in like the wrong order or the wrong notes. But sometimes I don't feel compelled to use those phrases, and I just kind of do something random. And so, yeah, I like that it is a different experience every time, and it has to do with like how I'm feeling or how I'm reacting or how I'm experiencing the piece. And now, since the piece has been shown without the live performance like so much, I feel so much differently about the film than I did when I made it. So I think that maybe that comes through, at least in my experience of the film, that sorry, I don't know where I was going with that.
It's okay. I mean, I think we need to open it up to our audience for questions in a second here. But it did make me think that maybe it's not just how you feel about the piece, but how you feel about the people who you're watching it with.
Yeah.
That might affect how you play.
Yeah.
Do we have any thoughts? We need to run a mic if we could.
Sure. So I just had a few thoughts kind of prompted by that really kind of generative set of questions. And really interesting discussions. And I guess the first thing that really comes to mind on like really multiple levels, prompted by what people have said, is really this this idea of anticipation on multiple levels. I mean, I'd say, first of all, my own anticipation, having not yet, seen the works, but also having, spoken to Lewis a lot kind of before he came, and this idea of his own anticipation, right? Having made a work, having it, been presented in screened in so many places, and yet, his own anticipation and his presence here. So it just has me thinking about this anticipation more generally, right? Because clearly there's a kind of extreme anticipation that we've all experienced over the course of this pandemic, and but then I think about anticipation more generally in video work and installation work, where people they travel to go see a work, they go to at a museum, at a gallery, and so much of it is this anticipation, right? This moment of before you're in, or this moment of, when there's finally a place for you to see because there aren't people blocking your way. And then, I guess, I think I find that kind of so interesting. And then that brings me to this idea of architecture, which is the sort of frame of the panel, and how anticipation is also so key in architecture, right? Like people travel and they think their whole lives about, the Sistine Chapel, right? Which only really exists, that it's the idea of being there, of presence. And that really interests me too, because at first when I was thinking, it's like anticipation, is that the anticipation of the architect who's waiting to see his or her, their work being built? But then I just thought about anticipation, the anticipation of being in the space of the Mona Lisa or the Sistine Chapel, or, some new Frank Gehry monstrosity that, or masterpiece. So I just was thinking a lot about all those ideas of anticipation as both being present in this like really extreme way now, but also being, somehow capturing this relationship between maybe the architecture of space and, and all of that. So that was one thought. And
Yeah, I think that Lewis's piece maybe addresses perhaps the greatest anticipation of the 20th century in the US, which was the anticipation of landing on the moon.
Is that a question?
Is mine a question?
Yeah.
Was it? I don't know if it was intended to be a question. I mean, I guess the prime question would be like, what do people think about these? Oh, sorry. I'm a little skittish, honestly, about this this microphone, which seems to kind of, in and of itself, kind of embody the kind of transfer of saliva from one. I mean, just to be honest, I find it a kind of problematic object in this scenario. But I can. Yeah, I'm curious to know if other people kind of are. I don't know if this idea of anticipation connects in some ways to the idea of architecture and experience.
Well, let me reframe the idea. I mean, at least my way of thinking anticipation. The men went to the moon as an extension of not an extension of the Earth, but an extension of the of the sort of colonization of the universe, but and it was termed the new frontier, but in some way it never was in competition with the Earth. And contemporarily, the anticipation is that the Earth has been sullied, and via Elon Musk or the like, we need to think about Mars or the moon as a future place to live, because the Earth is, has a dystopian future. And so the anticipation is, and in my mind, is this idea of the new frontier, which is shown to be so barren in the documentation of the moon landing, is, the anticipation that is our ecological future, is traveling into space to save ourselves, like some, So, and on the other hand, you have the little animals that are running around, and anticipation that they're wild animals, but the new wilderness is the urban landscape. And many animals are becoming extinct, dying or have smaller numbers because of the environmental effect of humans. But these animals actually are thriving. I mean, they've moved into an urban environment. So the anticipation is that, unlike a new frontier, it's the new wilderness, the environment that we live in. So the anticipation, to me, is this changing idea of the landscape that we potentially live in the future, with these animals running around in our streets and people sending themselves into space to have a future. And they're very kind of peculiar notions of anticipation, which have varying levels of reality, particularly living on the moon. So anyway, my idea of anticipation is these animals, the future for the animals and the future for space travel is about anticipation.
Another question? There's one right here.
Well, I think what Hannah is bringing up is interesting in terms of anticipation, right? All these anticipations that we're dealing with in our current moment. But I think that there's also a difference in anticipating, and I'm interested in that all the time. We all experience it, right? I'm going to go on an airplane. I'm going to go to a place. This is how it's going to look to in my mind. It doesn't look like that when I arrive. And as soon as I arrive, the memory of what it was going to be is gone, at least for me. I have no memory of that vision I had of a place anymore. It's completely obliterated. But there's also another level when you're talking about anticipation. I think we can distinguish a little bit about also something that is related to anticipation, which is anxiety. And I think anxiety is also sort of this idea of being able to project into the future, and the idea of being able to both project our memory, but also the idea of projecting stasis of a moment into the future, and also projecting the past into the future. And in that, in short, if there is a question in here, is that I do believe we're failing at doing that, and that could maybe it ends up being a generic question in thinking about failure and anxiety. I know that Nima can talk about that, at least for sure. So can you talk about that in relation to your work and projecting? But I think also with Louis, I'm also like personally completely sort of voyeuristically interested in hearing what you're anticipating seeing in this installation that you haven't seen yet, so that we can have a record of that memory that's going to disappear.
I don't know how I can answer this question, but about the failure and anxiety, I think the resources that I have, which are like a collection of this found footage, they all have like collection of sort of failure in multiple like aspect, like failure of humanity, failure of streaming online, failure of attracting viewer, failure of and also in the world, failure of the static, and the anxiety is I think always with me. It's like I'm an anxious person, and I think also, yeah, it's like I have some idea about like sensor anxiety that that's why it's sometimes very hard for me to touch a camera and record something that I really want to and bring it to my. I used camera before, but then after that I had this feeling that okay, like sometimes this anxiety goes to the camera and goes to the sensor and goes to all these like memory card and then my hard drive and then go to my like these like. And because these are like sensitive system and they can like carry all this anxiety, so that's why sometimes this sensor becomes senseless, and cannot capture any anxiety unless just caring about the outcome, result, and being like just a static form or informative form without solving any issues or anxiety or problem. So I don't know where I'm going with this thing, but yeah. And so in this restless image, you can see all this anxiety that it's impossible to watch them because they are stupid. They do not follow any sort of structure and aesthetic, but it's still like able to be more value and devalue some sort of situation that we define in our system. I don't know if I'm very like fragmented, but it's my mind. Bear with me.
Well, that ties into, I mean, as witnessed by the emails and correspondence between Nima and myself setting up the installation, my anxiety was totally technological. You know, like, can we do this? How is this going to look? Is this high enough? Is the screen big enough? So my anxiety was the fact that two things. One, I couldn't be here to set it up. And not only could I not be here to set it up, but then I went off the map up until yesterday. And so I couldn't answer any questions that might arise. So my anxiety was the fact that I couldn't participate in its installation. And so so now in terms of going and looking at it, I don't have an anxiety because he said it looked good. So I trust him. And he's got all the anxiety, right, about my work now, not me. So I'm just looking forward to experiencing it. And the anxiety about the piece is gone. I'm just hoping that in my mind, what I imagine and have partially experienced, I'll actually get to see my own work because I've never seen it before. I mean, so that's going to be the real pleasure. So that's the anticipation, and it's one of glee rather than fear.
Any other questions out there? Emily, was this something that you felt you could respond to?
I'm thinking about the anticipation and like the anticipation of seeing your work. And for me, I was anticipating the performance a lot because it had been months since I even played my toy xylophone. So I had to like relearn the song. I went on YouTube and found like a children's video of how to play You Are My Sunshine, and just practiced for the day before. And then I had some people coming to see it who like are my partner's parents. And I was like, okay, I'm bringing them to an experimental film festival. I don't know what they think about this. Have they seen experimental films before? Like what? And this is my first time meeting them. I was anticipating like, wow, like I'm going to show them my films that are like quite strange in comparison to like probably most of the films they've seen in their lives. And then I'm going to make them sit through this program of like an hour and a half of other films that are probably a lot different from the films that they've seen in their lives. And I have so much I do have a bit of anxiety about bringing people to experimental film screenings because a lot of my past experiences bringing non-filmmakers to these kinds of film screenings, they usually just get really mad at me. They're like, Emily, why did you bring me here? I'm anxious. There's just this droning and this flashing lights. And I'm like, guys, this was the most fun I've had all week. And they're like, no, this is terrible. But it ended up fine. But yeah, I have that experience of anticipation and anxiety about the performance and about showing films to people who I don't know how they feel about art.
Yeah, and just something about anticipation, and back to Eric when he noticed this situation when you see your installation and want to tweak it for the next show. It's like the anticipation that you always know that you're gonna hate your work in your installation. That's why you want to tweak that, or sometimes not show it again, and like kind of expired, maybe something else. Because also at some point you will not receive any sort of clap. So, and I think it's a very honest way, because we are not trying to just pretend that we are supporting or we are liking or something like that. That's why I like say that it's very honest and it's very clear, and it is the anticipation that you already know the answer, that you're gonna hate your work. It's a personal things, but
Well, this also brings in the idea that even though, like in installation works or in this performance piece, even though there's something more that feels more material about these sorts of documentary works, there's also something more ephemeral in that, because the object of the work of art is that encounter, is that experience, something that you can't really take with you in the same way that you might be able to go from theater to theater throughout the world with a piece. And so even though it has this materiality and almost like monstrosity to it, right, with all the cables sticking out everywhere and the projection system and all the, the projector stands and things like that, it's got this kind of apparatus. It feels so so immovable sometimes when it's an installation work, and yet the experience of it is more ephemeral because it's so much more specific. Yeah, I really like this idea from Lauritz of projecting an imagination of something, and that imagination becoming a memory that is destroyed once you experience it. Like it has this almost kind of renewing quality to it. Any last final questions? Emmett.
I'm curious about, because I feel like all three of your pieces are so related to body and space. I'm curious, in the point of creation, what your relationship to the space that you were in while making these films or installations was like. So was your editing room set up? Or is it in the mind, or does the body play a factor in that process for you, I guess?
Well, my work, as always the case, is an act of accretion. I mean, I set up the cameras to figure out what little animal was running across my roof, and then I started recording the animals, and then I tried to figure out what I could do with them to in some way mimic my marvel and experience with them. And because I was geographically, fixed in a house and in a place, and you're talking about, particularly people fixed in their houses in particular places at this moment in time, that I thought that it was important that there be a center to this action rolling around, both in the audio of the astronauts and in the animals, that the stuff isn't necessarily not one of some kind of mobility, but it was one of being in one place and having these things move around you to define where you were. And so the out of the act of accretion of the sounds and the pictures, it became sort of a demand of the material that it establishes its own world in which the viewer sits in or swivels around in or whatever. And so that's in that way, I sort of became aware of how it should be. It wasn't some master plan. It was just something that came out of the material itself.
yeah. So my practice is like, so I start a project, and so because I know that I go for multi-channel, I start the project and export it, put it on media player, install it in the studio to have experience of that. And of course, all the time when you send the work to another festival, or like not mostly festival, like shows that curated by some people, you will receive a different environment, different equipment. So sometimes say that, okay, we have a smaller screen. Sometimes they say that we do not have this quality of a screen or this size of the space, which you have to be always kind of be agree with them and say that just try it. So I think it's also another kind of interesting element of the installation, because it can change the size and the form and the space, and also viewer that can have different experience. Even the artist, the author cannot have the experience when he start or she started the work. And I think this kind of diverse situation, it's the thing that attract me to the video installation. There's no dictation at all. Even you have to be kind of, okay, go with whatever you have and install it and send me the image. It was always like this, yeah. For me, which is interesting.
I'm just latching on to your question of what's your editing setup. So for this film, I edited on Super 8. So I just had this viewer in my studio and all my film, and I'm just in silence because I need to get the timing right. So I'm just moving it around. But I think it's interesting because I almost forgot that this film, I did once install it as an installation. The text is cut on cardboard, and those cardboards I hung from the ceiling and then had 4 projectors with other images from the roles that would make up Who Wants to Fall in Love that didn't make it into the film. Those images were projected onto the cardboard, and so the text would show up on the walls, but the images would also show up on the cardboard text. And I only installed that once in my studio, which is the same place that I did all the editing for the like screen version of the film. So that studio is like really there's like many spaces in the film, right? Like Boulder is a space in the film, but my studio is also a space in the film because it's like where it came to fruition and where it has only lived as an installation.
Looks like we have another question.
I think it's more of a comment, but I think with Louis bringing up sort of the point of accretion, right, and that really brings us back to one of the sort of fundamental questions of documentary work, and brings us back to one of maybe the pillars of this festival is the documentary impulse, which I think Emma Piper in yesterday's conversation said, well, if I know what I'm going to do, then I might not do it at all, you know. And I think with both with what you were all saying, but what Emily was saying last is how Boulder is part of it, whether it's directly or indirectly, is that in documentary arts, we're not creating work in a vacuum. You're not a painter that's locked up in your own studio. So with Louis, I'm thinking about sort of course, the correspondence that you have on this habitat that is your house, and the circular movements that are happening around you, and the correspondences that you have with whether animal there is there. So you're existing within that ecosystem. And again, selfishly, I get interested in sort of asking very fundamental questions of what you learned of having close observation of your environment that sort of seeped into your everyday in a new way of being in that specific location.
Well, it's I mean, the big difference is that, when I go to bed at night and my lights go down, I know the lights of sorts go up for the animals to start prowling and moving and the like. And of course, there's lots of stuff that's not in the film. I mean, there are owls and other kinds of nocturnal sounds, coyote howls, things like that are not part of the film. I mean, I just became mostly much more aware of the fact that I was not merely a human presence around my house. It was a whole environmental system, which usually you think of something, when you think of an environmental system, you think of something, the elk or the buffalo or, something more exotic. But all of a sudden, it's very close to home. I mean, obviously, people have experience with perhaps a snake or a spider or something like that around their house, or ants, certainly. But you don't ever imagine that such a rich environment that, is sort of National Geographic roaming around your house. So, and to get back to the way you started out your question, I think most documentary doesn't start out with a good documentary, doesn't start out with a name. It discovers it as it goes along. And it discovers a purpose, a meaning, and actually a topic as it goes along. But also, additionally, for me, I'm only interested in work which can fuck up. If I know it's going to succeed, I'm not in the least bit interested in doing it. It's only when I get myself really painted into a corner and have to figure out how to get out of it with the material that I've shot that it starts to get interesting. If I have a plan for and I know what I'm going to do, I'm not the least bit interested. So it's that idea of jeopardy. And maybe we're getting back to your question about anxiety. If I don't create a sense of anxiety about how it's going to look or how it's going to be, then to me, it's not interesting. And so that's sort of tie your two questions together.
I thought you were going to say something there, Nima. Any more? We really are running very low on time, and we do have time for one more question if it's out there. Well, great. Thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your work. This idea of like kind of expanded documentary arts is really important to Mimesis, and so we're really grateful that you decided to share your work with us and submit it and install it. Still up and running over in Atlas B2. This is the last day that you can check out these installations. So Atlas B2 on campus, expanded documentary arts at Mimesis. It's up until 6 p.m. at B2, yes. Thank you so much. And Nima, now you get your applause.